He was not a king, he was not an emperor. He was not a pope, yet Europe moved at his command. Wars were fought with his money, crowns were won with his loans. Popes ruled because of his credit. This is the story of Jacob Fugger the Rich, the banker who didn't rule Europe, he owned the system that ruled it. Late 5th-10th century Europe was a chaotic place. It was unstable, violent, and almost always at war. The Holy Roman Empire was a fractured mess of competing states. Kings were perpetually bankrupt. Popes were desperate for money to fund their ambitions and their armies. Armies required gold, crowns required legitimacy, and legitimacy, as it turned out, required financing. Power was no longer just about bloodlines or the sharpness of your sword. Power was about liquidity, and one man controlled it all. So, who was Jacob Fugger? He was born in 1459 in Augsburg, Germany, a city already known as a hub for trade and finance. His family were wealthy merchants, but Jacob saw something more. He transformed banking from a simple business into a weapon. While kings boasted of their noble ancestry, Jacob mastered numbers. He understood interest rates, collateral, political leverage, and long-term debt. These are the concepts that define modern capitalism, and Jacob Fugger was perfecting them centuries before anyone else. Fugger's true power came from his control over mining. He secured monopolies by financing silver and copper mines in Tyrol, Hungary, and Bohemia regions that were absolutely critical to Europe's entire economy. Before long, Fugger controlled the vast majority of Europe's silver supply. Now, silver wasn't just currency. It was the metal of taxation. It was the fuel of warfare. It was pure, hard power. Kings couldn't mint new coins without Fugger's silver. Armies couldn't be paid without Fugger's loans. The entire European economy ran on metal, and Jacob Fugger owned the metal. This brings us to the emperor for sale. In 1519, the Holy Roman Empire faced a major crisis. The old emperor was dead, and a new one had to be elected. There were two main candidates, Francis I of France and a young man named Charles of Habsburg, who would later become the legendary Emperor Charles V, but emperors weren't chosen by popular vote or by their virtue. They were chosen by money. The 7 prince-electors who decided the outcome demanded massive bribes. Charles didn't have that kind of cash, but Jacob Fugger did. Fugger financed Charles' election with over 850,000 florins, a fortune so immense it is hard to even comprehend today. Without that money, Charles would have never become emperor. The history of Europe would have been completely different. From that moment forward, the most powerful man in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor, owed his crown to a banker from Augsburg. This wasn't just influence, this was ownership. But Fugger didn't stop with emperors. He also financed the Vatican. Popes borrowed heavily from him, especially to fund the grand rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The problem was, the church had no money to pay him back. So, they came up with a creative solution. They started selling indulgences. These were official certificates promising forgiveness for sins, all in exchange for a cash donation. And guess who was in charge of collecting the payments? Jacob Fugger's bank. A significant portion of every single indulgence sale went directly into Fugger's pockets to repay the Vatican's loans. This system became so corrupt and so widely abused that it sparked outrage across Europe. It was this practice that led a German monk named Martin Luther to nail his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517. His protest against the sale of indulgences ignited the Protestant Reformation. Think about that for a second. Jacob Fugger's financial system, designed to get his money back from the Pope, helped trigger one of the greatest religious revolutions in human history. At this point, you might be wondering why nobody stopped him. Kings hated Fugger, popes feared him, but none of them could challenge him. He was simply too big to touch. If a ruler refused to repay Fugger's loans, their army would go unpaid and likely mutiny. If a pope defaulted on a loan, the entire Vatican would lose credibility. If a whole kingdom collapsed, Fugger didn't lose. He simply seized the mines, lands, and tax revenues that he held as collateral. Jacob Fugger had engineered a system where even the failure of others benefited him. He once famously wrote to the emperor himself, saying, "I know very well that I am richer than the emperor." That wasn't arrogance, it was simple mathematics. Jacob Fugger wasn't just rich, he was structurally powerful in a way we've never seen before or since. He diversified his assets across the entire continent. He manipulated supply chains to his advantage. He even financed both sides of conflicts, knowing he'd profit no matter who won. He used debt as a form of leverage, not as charity. The core principles of modern banking: centralized finance, political lobbying, using strategic debt to gain power, all trace their roots back to him. To put his wealth into perspective, in today's money, Jacob Fugger's fortune would exceed $400 billion. That's richer than Rockefeller, richer than Bezos, richer than Musk, but unlike them, Fugger didn't just influence markets. He decided who ruled Europe. Jacob Fugger died quietly in 1525. He had no throne, no crown, and no army of his own. Yet the world he built remained. Empires would continue to rise and fall on credit. Wars would be fought with borrowed money. And banks would slowly but surely replace kings as the true power brokers in the world. The system that Jacob Fugger created never disappeared, it just evolved. Today, rulers still depend on financiers. Governments around the world are still drowning in debt. Wars are still funded by international banks. Jacob Fugger didn't conquer Europe with swords and shields. He conquered it with numbers on a ledger. He proved a terrifying truth that is still relevant today. You don't need to rule the world to control it. You just need to own the system it runs on. Jacob Fugger was not history's richest man. He was history's most dangerous banker. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the figures who secretly shaped our world.